The Soviet manned lunar programs were a series of programs pursued by the Soviet Union to land a man on the Moon in competition with the United States Apollo program to achieve the same goal set publicly by President John F. Kennedy on May 25, 1961. The Soviet government publicly denied participating in such a competition, but secretly pursued two programs in the 1960s. Manned lunar flyby missions using Soyuz 7K-L1 spacecraft launched with the Proton-K rocket, and a manned lunar landing using Soyuz 7K-L3 and LK lander spacecraft launched with the N-1 rocket. Following the dual American successes of the first manned lunar orbit on December 24, 25, 1968 and the first moon landing on July 20, 1969, and a series of catastrophic N-1 failures, both Soviet programs were eventually brought to an end. The Proton/Zond program was cancelled in 1970, and the N-1 per liter 3 program was terminated de facto in 1974 and officially cancelled in 1976. Details of both Soviet programs were kept secret until 1990, when the government allowed them to be published under the policy of glasnost. Early concepts. Although the Soviet leadership had made public pronouncements about landing a man on the Moon and establishing a lunar base as early as 1961, serious plans were not made until several years later. Sergei Kirillaev, the senior Soviet rocket engineer, was more interested in launching a heavy orbital station and in manned flights to Mars and Venus. With this in mind, Kirillaev began the development of the Super Heavy N-1 rocket with a 75-ton payload. In its preliminary moon plans, Kirillaev's design bureau initially promoted the Soyuz ABC circumlunar complex concept, under which a two-man spacecraft would rendezvous with other components in Earth orbit to assemble a lunar flyby excursion vehicle. The components would then be delivered by the Proton A7 rocket. After developing the N-1, beginning in 1963, Kirillaev began to plan a moon landing mission using two launches and docking. Later Kirillaev managed to increase the payload of the N-1 to 92 to 93 tons and increasing the number of engines in its first stage from 24 to 30, providing enough power to accomplish the mission with a single launch. Another main space design bureau headed by Vladimir Chalomy proposed a competing cislunar orbiting mission using a heavy UR-500K rocket and a two-man LK-1 spacecraft. Later, Chalomy also proposed a moon landing program with a Super Heavy UR-700 rocket and an LK-700, LK-3, spacecraft. The Soviet government issued a response to the American Apollo challenge after 3 years. According to the first government decree about the Soviet manned moon programs, adopted in August 1964, Chalomy was instructed to develop a moon flyby program with a projected first flight by the end of 1966, and Kirillaev was instructed to develop the moon landing program with a first flight by the end of 1967. Following the change from Nikita Khrushchev to Leonid Brezhnev in 1964, the Soviet government in September 1965 assigned the flyby program to Kirillaev, who redesigned the cislunar mission to use his own L-1 spacecraft and Chalomy's Proton rocket. Kirillaev organized full-scale development of both programs, but died after surgery in 1966. According to a government decree of February 1967, the first manned flyby was scheduled for mid-1967, and the first manned landing for the end of 1968. Kirillaev's death, along with various technical and administrative reasons, as well as a lack of financial support, resulted in both programs being delayed. Launch schedules. As of 1967, the L-1 per liter 3 launch schedules were, L-1, 2P, develop Block D stage, 3P, develop Block D stage, 4L, unmanned lunar flyby, 5L, unmanned lunar flyby, 6L, manned lunar flyby, 7L, manned lunar flybys, 8L, manned lunar flybys, 9L, manned lunar flybys, 10L, manned lunar flybys, 11L, manned lunar flybys, 12L, manned lunar flybys, 13L, reserve spacecraft, L3, 3L, develop LV in blocks G and E, 4L, reserve, 5L, LOK-LK unmanned, 6L. LOK-LK unmanned, 7L, manned LOK unmanned LK, 8L, manned LOK unmanned LK, 9L, piloted LOK unmanned LK with LK landing on Moon, 10L, first men land on Moon, 11L, reserve, 12L, reserve. Cosmonauts. In 1966, two cosmonaut training groups were formed. One group was commanded by Vladimir Komarov and included Yuri Gagarin, and was to prepare for qualification flights of the Soyuz in Earth orbit and a Proton-launched Tsar lunar mission. Komarov later died in the Soyuz 1 spaceflight when his parachute malfunctioned, causing his capsule to smash into the Earth at high speed. The second group was led by Alexei Leonov and concentrated on the landing mission. As a result, Leonov has the strongest claim to have been the Soviets' first choice for first man on the Moon. After Komarov's death in Soyuz 1 in 1967, Gagarin was taken out of training and the groups were restructured. Despite the Soyuz 1 setback, the Soviets successfully rehearsed the automated docking of two unmanned Soyuz craft in Earth orbit in 1968, and with the manned Soyuz 4 and Soyuz 5 joint mission in early 1969 tested the other key mission elements. A total of 18 missions were related to the N1L3 project. Moon flyby UR500K, Proton/L1, Zund, program. Launched by a three-staged Proton rocket, the L1, Zund, was a spacecraft from the Soyuz family and consisted of 2 or 3 modified modules of the main craft Soyuz 7K with a total weight of 5.5 tons. The Apollo orbital spacecraft for the lunar flyby also had 2 modules but was 5 times heavier, carried a crew of 3 and entered lunar orbit, whereas the L1 performed a flight around the Moon and came back on a return trajectory. Planned for December 8, 1968 for priority over the U.S., a first-man mission of the L1 was cancelled due to insufficient readiness of the capsule and rocket. After Apollo 8 won the first phase of the Moon race at the end of 1968, the Soviet leadership lost political interest in the L1 program. A few reserve units of L1 made unpiloted flights, but by the end of 1970 this program was cancelled. Moon landing N1 per Liter 3 program. The manned landing plan adopted a similar method to the single launch and lunar orbit rendezvous of the Apollo project. For mission safety, weeks before the manned mission, an LKR unmanned L3 complex and 2 Lunar-clad automated rovers would be sent to the Moon, to work as radio beacons for manned LK, with the LKR used as a reserve escape craft. The Lunar-clads were also equipped with manual controls for the cosmonauts, both for transfer to LKR in necessity and for regular research. The N1 rocket would then carry the L3 Moon Expedition Complex, comprising 2 spacecraft and 2 boosters. A variant of the Soyuz craft, the lunar orbital Korabl command ship, would carry 2 men, with 3 modules like the regular Soyuz 7K, but was heavier by a few tons. The 7K was half the mass of the 3-man Apollo orbital command ship. The lunar Korabl accommodated only 1 cosmonaut, so in the Soviet plan only 1 cosmonaut would land on the Moon. The mass of the LK was 40% of the mass of the Apollo lunar lander. The L3 complex to be placed in LEO by the N1 was 93 tons. The mass of the LOK and LK was 40% of the Apollo complex, but was equivalent to the L3 complex without Block G. The booster for the LEO toward the Moon for the Apollo vehicle was provided by the last stage of the Saturn V, while for the Block D, LOK and LK, this was to be provided by Block G of the same L3 complex. During the L3 complex's journey to the Moon, there would be no need to undock and redock the orbital and landing craft as was done in Apollo, because the cosmonaut would transfer from the LOK to LK by a spacewalk. On the Apollo missions, the transfer was done using an internal passage. Block D was to slow the LOK and LK into lunar orbit, while with Apollo this phase was undertaken by firing the engine on the service module to slow the complex and enter lunar orbit, since the Apollo complex traveled with the command module and lunar excursion module facing back towards the Earth. Once in orbit, the LK with Block D would separate from the LOK and descend toward the surface of the Moon using the Block D engine. After Block D exhausted its fuel, the LK was to separate and complete landing using its own engine. On the Moon, the cosmonaut would take moonwalks, use lunar cods, collect rocks, and plant the Soviet flag. After a few hours on the lunar surface, the LK's engine would fire again using its landing structure as a launch pad, as with Apollo. To save weight, the engine used for landing would blast the LK back to lunar orbit for an automated docking with the LOK. The cosmonaut then would spacewalk back to the LOK carrying rock samples. The lake would then be cast off, after which the LOK would fire its rocket for the return to Earth. After the U.S. moon landing in 1969, the justification for the Soviet lunar landing program largely evaporated, although development and testing continued into the early 1970s. In 1970–1971 the LK was ready after 3 unmanned test flights in LEO. The LOK launched once. The K lunar spacesuit and support systems were tested. 4 N1 test launches in 1969, 1971, and 1972 were failures, despite improvements after each crash. The second launch, on July 3, 1969, resulted in the destruction of the rocket and the entire launch complex, which delayed the N1L3 program for 2 years. In an automatic moon flyby, these first 2 launches of the N1 carried the 7K-L1S spacecraft. The dummy 7K-LOK and regular 7K-LOK with dummy LKs were used in the 3rd and 4th launches. The complete L3 lunar expedition complex with the 7K-LOK and LK for the moon flyby and landing was prepared for a 5th launch, using a modified N1 rocket on August, 1974. If this mission and the next had been successful, it would have led to the decision to launch up to 5 Soviet-manned N1L3 expeditions in 1976–1980. To gain technical and scientific interest in the program, the modified multi-launched N1FL3M missions were planned to have significantly more time on the Moon's surface than Apollo. However, N1L3 program was cancelled in May 1974, and Soviet manned space efforts subsequently concentrated on the development of space stations and on several design and ground preparatory processes for a Mars mission, which continues to the present day, but has unclear objectives. A moon base, Zvezda, that was proposed later, developed mock-ups of expedition vehicles and surface modules, and Vulcan LEK project were not adopted for economic reasons. As some recompense and as a replacement for the manned landing program, the Soviets fulfilled a program of automated delivery of lunar soil and lunokhod's automated moon rovers. The launch pad and MIK of N1 was redesigned for the Enarja-Buran shuttle program. 5 lakes and 3 LOKs remain, at least, with some kept in the designers' and producers' company museums. Nearly 150 engines produced for first stages of N1F were kept by manufacturer, then sold for use on U.S. launches around 2000. Gallery. See also, Apollo Program, Moon Exploration, First on the Moon, a Russian mockumentary, Soviet space program conspiracy accusations. References. External links. The Soviet Manned Lunar Program, The Soviet Manned Lunar Program, Why Did the Soviet Union Lose the Moon Race?